I did my dissertation on Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, and his relevance to the variety of schools of political theory, from the left to the right. I studied his influence on Richard Rorty, an American social democrat, Jacques Derrida, French postmodern thinker, Leo Strauss, and a neoconservative defender of classical political philosophy, and a Russian thinker named Alexander Dugin. The idea was to show how Heidegger has impacted a broad spectrum of schools of thought about political life, because all four of these people, Derrida, Rorty, Strauss, and Dugin, look to Heidegger as a source of inspiration for their political thought, whether because they're embracing part of his philosophy or a lot of his philosophy, or because they're rejecting it. So he's a key figure for all four of these schools, and that's what I wrote my project on, his impact and influence on those theorists and on the schools of thought that they set up. Now, writing the dissertation was not easy. It took a lot of work, a lot of reading, and a lot of serious thinking. But it wasn't the most difficult thing I did as a graduate student, because the most difficult thing I did as a graduate student was deal with the department politics concerning my work on Dugin in particular. I faced a lot of pressure for my work on Dugin. In fact, I had 4 faculty members resign from my committee over the course of 5 years. And they didn't only resign from my committee. In some cases, they accused me of many different things, including tacitly being an ISIS supporter, which I'm not, of being an anti-Semite, which I'm not, of supporting Satanism, which I don't, and so on. And all of these accusations were based on their rather quick and cursory reading on, I assume, Wikipedia, probably at most, about Alexander Dugin. So whereas I had been translating his books from Russian into English since late 2011, therefore had developed some level of expertise about his political philosophy, they apparently, as I say, learned about him, Googled his name, saw some articles, and lost their minds. So 4 professors quit my committee, and that's a very difficult thing to deal with, because you can't graduate from that program. You can't graduate with a PhD unless you defend your dissertation, which you have to do before a committee. And if nobody's willing to work with you because they think that you're beyond the pale, and if their reasons for thinking that are baseless, like they were in my case, it makes the graduate school experience a nightmare in many respects, which I would say is how I experienced it, for the most part. So I loved writing the dissertation. I loved reading the books. But if it wasn't for the faculty repression and the faculty politics, I probably could have been done in 2 years instead of in 5. Right. Or at least in 5 years, maybe I would have done much more work than I did. So it was unbelievable to me that at the University of Toronto Department of Political Science, there could be the unwarranted repression of inquiry into political and philosophical heterodoxy.
And so what were the arguments as to what they objected to?
All right, well, the arguments were, there were various arguments, all of which were very bad. So one was like this: I support Dugin. This is what I was told. I support Dugin. All right, already we can pause. Well, hang on a second. How much of Dugin do I support? Which parts do I and don't I support? For what reasons do I or don't I? What do I find appealing? What don't I find appealing? So all of the details of my interest in Dugin were just assumed. I support Dugin. It's the first part of the argument. He supports the enemies of liberalism, which include, for example, ISIS. Therefore, I support ISIS implicitly. And therefore, as one of the professors who resigned from my committee said, there's an unbridgeable gap between us. His son fights against ISIS, and I support ISIS. Again, false claim. Therefore, there's an unbridgeable gap between us. Therefore, he must resign from my committee. This is an educated man making this ridiculously idiotic claim. Not somewhere online, on Reddit, Not that I have anything against Reddit, but not in the dark corners of some online universe. At the University of Toronto, a preeminent institution of higher learning in Canada, in a Department of Political Science, a senior-most figure. So this chain of reasoning is absolutely beyond insulting and so on. It's just baffling. It's embarrassing. So that was one resignation.
And the most offensive part of that to me is not just that, if it's a false claim, the false claim that you support Dugin, but the idea that, because of my political position, I can't allow you to study that. My son fights ISIS.
Right.
And so because of my politics, you can't study this thing.
That's right. That's right. Also, it's one thing to be mistaken about somebody's motives or about somebody's opinions or somebody's thoughts. That's understandable. It probably happens all of the time. But the university is a place, especially in graduate relationships with your supervisors and with your advisors, and in a way with your people who are becoming your people for whom you're becoming an intellectual peer. There must be a more respectful conversation to see whether or not those views are accurate. So, but it was for all of the people who resigned from my committee, I can say that they didn't care so much about my side of the story. There was no interest. There was no intellectual interest in understanding the nature of my work on right-wing anti-liberalism in general and on Dugin in particular. So for example, I have, even since before starting undergraduate studies, had an interest in religious mysticism. So there are religious traditions within which there's a figure called a mystic, whether we're talking about Sufism and Islam, or whether we're talking about some other Kabbalism and Judaism, or some other form of mysticism. That has always been interesting to me. And my work on Russian philosophy didn't begin with Dugin. It began with a Russian mystic, a 19th century Russian philosophical mystic named Vladimir Solovyov. And my work on Dugin was it belonged in the context, not only of my political theory interest in right-wing anti-liberalism, but more originally, in my interest in Russian religious mystical tradition, you see? But the people who punished me for working on Dugin didn't care even to find that out, which again, there's no presumption, generally speaking, in our ordinary life that the people you talk to about something that is interesting to you have to give you the benefit of the doubt in every instance, and spend all of the time to figure out why you like what you like. Now, some people will, some people won't, some people don't have the time, and you can't demand it from them. But the university is a different story. Right. The university is a different story. And within the university, a graduate program in political theory is where, if anywhere, you would expect the patient study of political ideas across the board, it must be there. Maybe in a department of philosophy, but certainly in a department of political theory. And especially when the faculty members present themselves to the world and to their students in their books and in their public writings, like their op-eds, for example, as defenders of free inquiry. So the fact that self-declared defenders of free inquiry behaved in total contradistinction to their declared principles and acted like disgusting fascists themselves. I mean, they acted like the kinds of people that normally they would accuse of being themselves, vile and censorious and all of that. No, they did the same thing. So it's just been a very thought-provoking experience. Yeah. It's showed me the limitations of the declared defense of free speech among certain academic circles and among certain public intellectual circles too, because this unwillingness to listen seriously to right-wing anti-liberalism, again, it's most shocking to me in the university, but there are publications today, publications that are platforms for public intellectuals, for people who defend academic inquiry against its censorship, but they only defend classical liberals who have been scorned by the left. But as soon as there's someone to the right of classical liberalism who's been scorned by the liberals, that has no place on their map. They can't make sense of it. It falls beyond the scope of what is meaningful to them. Right. Or they just become hypocrites who take on the role of the left in this case and shut down the speech of the right. So what happened to me at the university, in my view, is of significance well beyond my case. I mean, I got over it personally. I found a new committee, I wrote my dissertation, I defended it, I earned my degree, I'm very happy, I learned a lot. But the resignations are significant well beyond me. They're significant because they identify the limitations and the hypocrisy of certain schools of thought and the blind spots that belong to certain political ideologies today, not where you would necessarily expect it, not necessarily on the left. In fact, my supervisor, my original supervisor, a self-professed liberal defender of philosophical inquiry, resigned my committee very ignobly and was replaced by a leftist, a Derridian, scholar of continental theory who works on Pentecostalism in Africa. You know, so the kind of person you would initially say, well, don't work with this leftist, continental Africanist. She stood by my project throughout all of the opposition. So the situation, it reconfigured, you know, all of the expectations. Well, that should be interesting. Any scientist who's doing a sort of experiment and they put something in the ecosystem that has suddenly reconfigured everything, you want to run that experiment more often, slow it down and see what happened. Why did this react like that when we put this thing here? So putting right-wing anti-liberalism on the table, Martin Heidegger, Alexander Dugin, to a certain extent Carl Schmitt, Leo Strauss, read in a certain way, putting that into the ecosystem and seeing how suddenly everybody changes their colors, you know? All of a sudden, the butterfly looks like a leaf and, you know, everything start moving that you thought were part of the scenery. I did them a favor in my view. You see, like brought to the surface a number of important fault lines and phenomena. Right. So they did me a favor because it was interesting for me, but the arrow goes both ways.
Right. And so, what is your experience? What did it leave you? The impression that it leave you about the university culture more broadly? What assessments would you say do you think you can draw?
Okay, for 5 years, I was a teaching assistant in political science. So I had, as a graduate student writing this work on Heidegger and political theory, I had this encounter with the professors that gave me a sense of their limitations. But as a graduate student interacting with students, I had a set of different experiences. They don't know who Heidegger is, they don't know who Dugin is necessarily. I didn't talk to them about right-wing anti-liberalism. I presented the material that we had as assigned by the professors who were teaching Introduction to Political Science, the course I TA'd most often, or another course on Ideas and Ideologies. And I can tell you, in my experience, the students are good. I mean, for the most part, the students that I had were willing to do the work and to do it well, to have respectful conversations with one another. For the most part, if the topics were something that had not put, let's say, anything too serious at stake, you know, they can share their thoughts or their opinions about this or another matter. But I did have students over the last 5 years come to me from time to time after class, maybe because they Googled me and saw some of my interests, or they heard about me from somewhere else or something like that. And they would tell me that they are unhappy that their professors propagandize in the classroom. That happened pretty often, actually. So I didn't tell them, your professors are propagandists. I didn't do that. Okay? My student reviews over 5 years are over 90% consistently. And that's not because I was propagandizing to one group that, you know, they're being left out. No, I treated everybody well, I treated everybody decently, and I treated the material with a very high degree of respect. So that's one thing I want to make clear. I was a good TA as reflected by the objective record. And students came to me often and said, this class is missing something, or why are they mocking Fox and Trump and Republicans? And why is this professor only telling us about how stupid conservatives are, not how stupid liberals or leftists are? In fact, often I had students from China tell me that they weren't expecting this level of propaganda in a Canadian classroom. I mean, that happened easily 3 out of the 5 years, okay, in an introduction to political science class. So in my experience, there are students who are indifferent. Let's just leave them alone. They'll take the class, do with it what they will. There are students who, on the other hand, are genuinely interested and hungry for some education in political science. They don't know what necessarily to expect or what's important, but they care about political life and political ideas, and they care about the topics that get discussed in class. But the problem is when a topic is presented so obviously from one perspective that the students, whether they know it or not, are being robbed of an education. They're not being given an education, they're being deprived of an education.
So I'll make this point that I made before, is that listening to your podcast and listening to your interviews and reading the National Post article, you have this robust defense of why you should be allowed to study illiberal ideas. And so many of the critiques that I've heard is, oh, these ideas are illiberal. And to me, that's so fascinating that you've built up such thick skin to defend yourself in the fact that you're studying illiberal ideas. Because for myself, it felt like the vast majority of the stuff I studied at York University was illiberal. We studied the canon, and then the majority of the contemporary stuff, like all of the SJW, identity politics, critical race theory, whiteness studies stuff was illiberal. Illiberal in the sense that it doesn't look at individuals, it looks at collectives. It assumes that marginalized people are oppressed simply by the nature of living in a society which is culturally particular to another people, which is illiberal in the sense that liberalism assumes that everyone should be able to do whatever they want to do, whereas this is saying that that's a physical impossibility. So my question is, since when is this a problem? Why do we have to defend ourselves suddenly? Why do they suddenly care? Why is it suddenly illegal to make illiberal or anti-liberal arguments?
Well, you see, I find it important to say right-wing anti-liberalism, because that already solves much of the puzzle for us. A student today can easily encounter basically liberal ideas in a department of political science or anywhere else. They can also be exposed to the leftist critique of liberal ideas. Sometimes there are entire programs that stem from leftist critique of liberalism ideologically, built into their foundation. Grievance studies are largely leftist critique of liberalism axiomatically. Well, if we now look to see, is right-wing anti-liberalism represented anywhere in an intellectually sound manner? In other words, we study liberal theorists, not just liberal ideas. You can actually be exposed to the axioms and ideas of liberalism. And you'll study Marx in a first-year political science class. You probably did. And not only Marx, but Marxists and neo-Marxists and postmodern thinkers. So there's a theoretical basis or foundation, and that's good. There should be, in my view. But by the same token, there should be an acknowledgement of right-wing anti-liberalism as a rich theoretical tradition that can't be reduced to Nazism, to Hitlerism, to anti-Semitism, to fascism, to racism, and to all of the things to which it now is reduced as an act of rhetorical dismissal. A student today who wants to study right-wing anti-liberalism, they may not think of it that way. I want to study right-wing anti-liberalism. They'll just know there's something about bourgeois morality, about production and consumption of material and spiritual values that I think is not the end of the story of human existence. And at the same time, the leftist view of equality of outcome and of a leveling of the great to the mediocre is even perhaps less satisfying. There must be an alternative, such a student may say. Yet such a student has nowhere to go for the theoretical elaboration of that position. Now, that is unforgivable because there is an intellectually legitimate and respectable tradition of right-wing anti-liberalism. Now, I used to think about it this way when I was an undergraduate. If I ask you to name, let's say, 3 or 4 or 5 leftist thinkers, most students, I think, could do so, okay? They'd say maybe Derrida, Foucault, Zizek, assuming they care about theory, right? If you were to ask them to name a couple of liberal thinkers, maybe, Mill, Hayek, or something like that. Now, if you were to ask them, name a couple of outstanding right-wing thinkers, I believe they would be at a total loss. In the best case scenario, well, two scenarios. In one scenario, they would name a liberal Republican style thinker as a right-wing thinker. But that's an impoverished model of the political spectrum, because Republican conservatives are really right liberals. They're not right anti-liberals. So they would have either an impoverished conception of the political spectrum, or in the best case scenario, we can imagine, because I don't believe it would happen, they would say Nietzsche and maybe Heidegger. Now, that is a huge stretch. That's very unlikely to happen. But look, let's suppose they had named Nietzsche. So now they can tell you a number of leftist thinkers, a number of liberal thinkers, and at best, maybe one truly right-wing anti-liberal. Now, if we examine that further, what will we see? That Nietzsche has become most popular academically, not on the right, but on the left. So if they ever have encountered him, it's more likely that they encountered him from the left than from the right. But they might just have heard in passing that he belongs on the right and not on the left. Right. So there is a huge gap missing in the political spectrum that's taught at the university. Now that has at least two very big drawbacks. The first very big drawback is that it blinds us to a proper analysis of political phenomena. People who are surprised by the victories of right-wing political parties, or by right-wing populism, or by even the combination of right and left parties in Italy, and maybe in France, if that's what awaits France. These people are blind to these political events because their political vocabulary wasn't rich enough to see in advance the possibility of those parties or those ideas. I'll give you an example. My former supervisor, the first person to resign from my committee, Ronald Biener, wrote a book, which I recommend, called Dangerous Minds, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and the Return of the Far Right. And after Trump's victory, this professor, whose life it is to study political ideas, whose life it is to study political theory and political philosophy, was blindsided that there could be a resurgence of right-wing ideas. Now, why is he blindsided? He must be blindsided because his view of what is relevant and important and possible politically had been impoverished until reality hit him in the face, until he was mugged by reality, so to speak. So that's one example of many. In my view, for example, if you're a foreign policy analyst, an American or Canadian or Western European foreign policy analyst, and you regard Russia as your geopolitical enemy, you must be willing to understand Russia as it understands itself. Its geopolitical playbook, its ideological playbook, and so on. But you could only do that if your political vocabulary was rich enough to invite into your mind, like to entertain the idea, of the Russian conservative critique of liberalism. You see? In other words, the failure to take right-wing anti-liberalism seriously results in bad policy. It results in political error. That is important. That's hugely important. But it's not the only drawback to the failure to consider the full political spectrum. Even more important from the point of view of the task of the university is that an education means liberating the mind from its constraints so that it can see the big picture. Without the big picture, there's no real education in the classical liberal sense of a liberal education. You don't need to see the big picture to be technologically competent in the programming of a computer or in some sort of other mechanical operation. But if we are educating not just technicians, but citizens and men and women and human beings, their education must rise to a broad embrace of human and political life. If we are cutting the political spectrum so radically that students and professors don't know there's life beyond liberalism and leftism, then we're not just impacting our ability to do correct policy analysis, we are kneecapping the education of full-fledged human beings. Right. So the study of right-wing anti-liberalism ought to be part of a well-rounded education, well-rounded civic and human education, at least as far as it's not merely technical. Right. In a way, Plato, this is anachronistic, I admit, okay, but it may help to illustrate it. Plato is in a sense a right-wing non-liberal or anti-liberal. He doesn't share the presuppositions of liberalism about the nature of truth, knowledge, morality, and humanity. And in fact, there are some liberal professors who see the serious study of Plato as a red flag. Forget about Dugin, Heidegger, and Nietzsche. They would caution you against studying Plato, Aristotle, and Aurelius, Marcus Aurelius. If you saw the article that came out not too long ago warning people that interest in Marcus Aurelius is a red flag. Well, I'm sorry, that has gone too far. That's gone much too far. So the defense of right-wing anti-liberalism acknowledges that you have liberal orthodoxy, basically, a liberal hegemony in terms of most disciplines. In some programs and in some schools, you have the attack from the left, and nowhere do you have adequately represented the tradition on the right. And I thought that once you point that out, everybody should recognize that it's a problem. Right. But obviously, that is not what happened in my case, and it's not what happens generally, because it's not just an accident that there's no right-wing anti-liberalism represented on the spectrum. It's part of a political project that has tried to delegitimize those thinkers.
Right. And I would think a huge concern of people who are interested in these ideas is if you don't teach us, this was my experience, if you don't, I was really, it stood out to me that how come we study so many of these ideas that our whole lives we've thought were evil and wrong, and then we go to university and we find out that there is some legitimacy to them, like Islamic, Islamism or communism, or so many different ideas that I thought were, oh, these are bad ideas, but then I go to school and they teach, there's rationale behind these positions. And I remember thinking to myself, we study all these ideas, how come we never study any right-wing ideas? How come we never study Nazism? And for myself, my education in those issues of right-wing thought did not come from the university. I went to go find it on my own. And my education in right-wing ideas came from right-wing websites, alt-right, white nationalist websites. And I would think that if professors are concerned about how the effect that these ideas might have on people, that they would want to be the ones to introduce and perhaps control the teaching of those ideas to make sure that they're not perhaps twisted.
Absolutely. Yeah. It is a remarkable shortcoming on the part of professors who care about the education of their students, who don't want them to go too far to the right or too far to the left, who want to keep them moderate, which is a respectable thing to do and a defensible thing to do, but who push them to the extremes by mocking their interest or failing to grasp the nature of their interest, or as they did in my case, completely baseless accusations and so on, ones that don't make any sense even. That is, to my mind, the greatest moral failing of professors today. Because, and I should add, it's not a new thing. So here's what I want to say about that. Professors and educators who don't take right-wing anti-liberalism seriously will produce much more of the problem that they're trying to avoid. That is a guarantee. Because they won't be able to kill the interest in the hearts and souls of those students who have it in human excellence as they see it, and in tradition and traditional values. They won't be able to. All that they will be able to do is to cause that interest to become either distorted or not necessarily distorted, but to have to find its outlet elsewhere. I mean, there's an old saying, you can chase nature out the door with a pitchfork, but it'll make its way back in through the window. So the liberal professors who think they can chase right-wing students out the door with a pitchfork, they don't know what's coming to them. Well, maybe if they had read more Aurelius, I don't know, you see? But what is needed, as Leo Strauss once said, is old-fashioned, undogmatic educators who understand the hearts and the passions of their pupils and who can take their legitimate concerns seriously. And the worst thing for those students, Strauss said, and it's as true now as it was when he said it, the worst thing for those students are progressive teachers who belittle and just fail to understand those students altogether. They don't know, these teachers, that they're shooting themselves in the foot. And the fact that they don't know it tells you the limitation of their own education. And it tells you the limitation of what can be expected from them as educators. So it is it's a big problem.
Yeah.
Now, I think that there are some tendencies today that are redressing the imbalance somewhat. Jordan Peterson is an example. He doesn't have a solution to every question that concerns the limitations of academic study of the political and ideological spectrum. But he has called out by name certain departments and certain approaches, and he has a more patient, I'm not saying it's perfect, but we're talking about redressing an imbalance. We're not talking about perfection. He has a somewhat more patient reading of Nietzsche and Heidegger and Dostoevsky and of the human condition than has been allowed in universities, it seems like, for quite some time. And I've had students come to me after class before to talk about Dugin because they have looked me up and see that I do work on him. And I've told them there are people today who are much more moderate than Dugin, but who you still couldn't study at the university without being called a fascist. And they say, you mean Jordan Peterson? So even they know, regardless of what you might learn from him, even he's off limits academically. Right. So how could you begin to study Nietzsche, Heidegger, Schmidt, or Dugin if even Peterson's off limits? Yeah. Well, the good news is that some serious people are making their videos available online so that when young students with an interest in right-wing anti-liberalism, however they call it for themselves, see that they're not getting anything at the university, in fact are getting worse than nothing because they're getting dragged into the opposite direction with no moderation, no forethought, and oftentimes no good reason. Now when they turn on YouTube or they go to some online network, they won't find only the wild speculations of some non-professional, which also has its place, don't get me wrong, but they'll find serious scholars who have done research for decades and who will be at least giving voice to some of their deep longings responsibly. That's important. It's a beginning. It's only a beginning, but it's certainly better than nothing.
You made this point about it's not healthy for students if their teachers mock their interest in right-wing ideas or their curiosity about right-wing ideas. For myself, it was never, I wouldn't describe it as having my interest in right-wing ideas mocked. It was the total absence of right-wing ideas and the mocking of the right wing in general that sparked my interest in the right wing. It's just kind of like two things. One is I felt like I only feel half educated. I feel like there might be another side of the story out there. So I went to the internet looking for it, and I found a lot of right-wing ideas. And another is that the criticism felt like brainwashing. Like I felt like, there's something amiss here. It's like, it reminds me of in The Wizard of Oz being told, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. It's like that, it's really, why not? And so that sent me out looking for it. But yeah, what do you think of that?
No, that's very, so sometimes it can be totally absent. Sometimes you can get a sense of it, like you said. Yeah. Something gets presented that doesn't feel right, doesn't sit right, doesn't gel with what you know or what you've experienced, what you've seen or what you've heard. In my view, it would be best if it was just on the table. Yeah. Because it's not like right-wing anti-liberalism isn't historically important. Everybody knows that it is. Yeah. In fact, I think it's because of their fear of its historical effect that they erase it even at the theoretical level. Right. They're afraid, like Biener writes, that if you take Heidegger and Nietzsche too seriously, you're going to be red-pilled by Nietzsche. You're going to become Richard Spencer. Right. Don't go, and if you read Marcus Aurelius, who knows who you'll become. Well, that fear is a problem. And the students, some students, not all of them, like I said, there are some who are indifferent. You could have been lecturing to them in a different language and they probably would not have noticed. But students who care, who are in this world and pay attention and just have their experiences and their own characteristics, they'll feel that something is off. That's what happened to you, right? They'll feel that something is missing or that something doesn't make sense. And wouldn't it be best if those missing parts were adequately addressed in the context of the education. In my view, it would be best, but it's not to be expected. I mean, ideally it's to be expected, but as the way things are now, I wouldn't hold our breath to start seeing more and more competent representatives of right-wing anti-liberalism at the university. I wouldn't bet on that future. One of the first ideas of Dugin's that appealed to me, the idea of the fourth political theory, was precisely related to this thing, because he said, if you think only in terms of liberalism, leftism, and fascism, and you're neither a liberal nor on the left, by default, you're put in the fascist category. And since everybody has an automatic and somewhat understandable revulsion to being called a fascist or to identifying with a fascist, even before having studied fascist political theory, that makes it impossible just schematically. You see what I'm saying? So he said, since this model no longer applies, and since it's suffocating our intellect, because it's forcing us into one of these categories, I, Alexander Dugin, will declare the fourth political theory as a space where we can be neither liberal, nor the best known versions of left liberalism, nor fascist. We could begin to think more freely about what matters to us outside of this constraining system. So many times I'd heard people say in different ways, well, you're not a liberal, you're not a communist, therefore you must be, a Nazi or something like that. And if you know, if you know about yourself that that's not accurate, now it might be, but if you know about yourself that, wait a minute, I don't think that actually captures my intellectual orientation, I wouldn't really say I'm a fascist. Yeah, I'm not liberal, no, I'm not a communist, but fascist, I don't know. And a person today couldn't even know if they're a fascist because nobody studies fascist political theory.
Right.
And there is such a thing.
Right.
It stems in part from the philosophy of Hegel. So that idea of the fourth political theory just showed me you can be thinking critically about liberalism without being either a leftist or a fascist. And yeah, so the development of the fourth political theory is something important, but so is the development of the third political theory. If people are going to study Hegel or Mill and they're going to study Marx, they should at least be able to name a single fascist political theorist, and they should have studied his arguments.
That's fascinating to even use that term, fascist political theorist. Like I never even really thought in that way. I mean,
Well, because the word is used now as slander.
Yeah.
That's just its use. But in fact, there is such a thing.
Yeah.
There were theorists of fascism, and they read German philosophy, and they had a set of arguments and ideas about human reason and its relationship to the state, for example. Well, a well-rounded education has to take that into account.
Right. And in his book, Dangerous Minds, Ronald Biener makes the point that Heidegger and Nietzsche were arguably the two most influential philosophers of the past, how long? 150 years, perhaps. What do you think of that? Do you agree with that? Is there truth to that? The two most?
Yes, I think that's probably fair to say, that they stand over everybody else with their intellect and with their influence.
And this point that keeps coming up about how these guys were actually right-wingers. Even though they're often interpreted through a leftist lens. Just that in itself is like, it stands out to me. Like it ties to this idea that I always kind of believed that right-wingers are dumb or conservatives are dumb, and there really isn't much there to right-wing thought. But the reality is that right-wing thinkers have been extremely influential and have contributed so much to Western thought.
Yes, I think that's fair to say. I think you could even generalize to the following principle. All political opinions that we might encounter can be traced to a more intellectually rigorous and serious theoretical articulation. Right. Whether they're fascist opinions or liberal opinions or leftist opinions, whether it's social justice warriors, or whether it's white nationalists or ethno-nationalists, all of them stand in some intellectual lineage. And if we actually are willing to go up from the political opinion to the statement of principles and arguments, well, that's a worthwhile endeavor. And then you'll see that, you might say you thought that conservatives were stupid, and then now you see that Nietzsche and Heidegger, and not only them, many other right-wing thinkers were eminent intellects. But you can also see on the left people that are social justice warriors who are like parodies of themselves. You would never take them seriously. Well, their opinions can be traced to serious writers. And so my view isn't that we should only study Nietzsche and Heidegger and Foucault, Derrida, Zizek, all of these French postmodern thinkers, banish them to the sidelines. In my view, the task is actually to go not necessarily from the left to the right, but from the world of unformulated or poorly formulated opinions up to their most solid elaboration. And usually it's philosophers who give that elaboration. I mean, usually political opinions derive from the well thought out statements of some philosopher.
Mm-hmm. And another thing that I've discovered is talking about these ideas is like the fact that Derrida and Foucault, I think of them as leftists, like postmodernism I associate with the left, but if they were so heavily influenced by Nietzsche, in a sense, these ideas are very right-wing in origin, or maybe not right-wing, but they come from a right-wing person.
Yes, so there's a book written in the 80s called Closing of the American Mind. It was a big sensation, a cultural criticism of leftism on campuses by Alan Bloom. And there's a chapter there with a very appropriate title called The Nietzscheanization of the Left. So how the left incorporated Nietzsche in order to fight against what they saw as their overclass or as their masters. So Nietzsche, like Heidegger in postmodern circles, they were both fully appropriated by leftist political theorists, sometimes strategically as a weapon of war, because some concepts in Nietzsche and Heidegger can be deployed in the service of leftist political aims rather effectively. Sometimes it was a legitimate intellectual encounter. My view when I started my dissertation was that Derrida was the former kind, that he used Heidegger as a weapon of war on the left. But I learned over the course of 5 years that his encounter with Heidegger is actually quite, it takes place on the philosophical level, not on the political level. But it is true that Heidegger and Nietzsche can be, and Schmitt, Carl Schmitt, is somebody else, that democratic political theorist. I mean, Carl Schmitt was a Nazi thinker on the right. His books are well worth reading, and he's a very smart man, but the fact remains he was a Nazi thinker on the right whose ideas were very influential on the left. So these leftist thinkers, they are not blind or stupid. They're aware of the existence of right-wing thinkers, but because they stand opposed to the right and they don't want to give it oxygen, they pick and choose certain ideas, certain concepts, certain arguments that may be helpful for their cause. They're very good at doing that, but that certainly doesn't free us of the obligation to see what they left out of the picture, you see, or to see exactly what their relationship is to Nietzsche or to Heidegger. In part, that's what I tried to do in my dissertation, trace for all of these schools how they use Heidegger, and whether that is a philosophical engagement or just a political one.
And then if we have time, can you squeeze in your story? Essentially just kind of reiterate your article, your point about the Psychology Today story. Yeah, this idea of how this definitely spoke to my experience. I've spoken about this before, this phenomenon that you see in so many of these courses, especially ones that are politically charged courses, where the teacher will propose a question to the class and they'll just sit in silence because the culture, they're so, tell me why.
Okay.
Yeah.
So everybody has probably experienced something along the lines of what you just said, that you are a student in a classroom and the professor has asked you a question and there's silence. Everybody is somehow inhibited from speaking up, and it's anyone, maybe 10 times or so. I had a situation like that in Introduction to Political Science course. We were reading about the social construction of race. That was the topic for that week. So I told the students about a video. I think it was Crowder. Do you know that guy? I think it was Crowder, but
I don't
it
think it was Crowder. I know the one that you
Okay, so I saw a video. I don't know even who. I can't even remember who it was. So it was some tall white guy in his 30s on a university campus talking to undergraduate students, and he asked them, what would you say if I were to tell you that I identify as a woman? I said, well, power to you. That's great. Fantastic. Or whatever. We don't care. All right, fine. For the most part, everyone was okay with it. Oh, what would you say if I tell you that I identify as Chinese? Okay, some people laugh. I mean, in the video, right? They don't know exactly. Some of them say, okay, again, whatever you want. More power to you. And so he goes through these various identity attributes until he concludes at the end and says, it shouldn't be the case that students on a university campus can't tell me I'm not a short black Chinese woman who's 5 years old or whatever, right? His point was that students are not willing to say, no, I'm sorry, you're not. You're not black, you're not Chinese, you're not short, and you're not a woman. You can't freely socially construct your identity out of thin air. So I told this to my students. I told them about this video, and I asked them, like he did, why, do you accept that he could socially construct or freely construct his race, his gender? And I did kind of the experiment with them, okay? And I told them about the video, and I wanted to get their opinion about why it seems harder in the case of, let's say, your height, right, or something else, than it does in the case of your gender. Now, I know that I could be engaging in the classroom. I have evidence, I have feedback. So I put it all on the line. I really went out of my way to make this interesting for the students. And again, it was because social construction of race was the topic for that week. I didn't just drag it in out of nowhere. And I asked them a question about, well, what are your thoughts about what I've just described? Nothing. No hands up, nothing. I was kind of crestfallen or, wasn't very pleased with that outcome because I'd gone out of my way to make it interesting. Class was coming to an end. I had another tutorial later that day, so I said, look, guys, I tried here with this scenario. What is the problem? What could I have done differently to set this up for you, to set up this issue so that you would have been willing to discuss it? Like, what did I do wrong, that nobody's talking about this? It's not like we're talking about something boring. This is interesting. So a young woman put up her hand, and she said, it's not you. You did fine. It's that I'm afraid that if I say something about this topic, I might offend somebody, it might be insensitive, I might get in trouble, that kind of thing. So then I asked the class, who else here didn't speak up for that reason? Because you were afraid of how other people would react. And for the first time in my time as a teaching assistant, I say this happened, which every professor would love to have happen in the classroom. Every single student's hand went up. I'm not exaggerating. Every student's hand went up. Everybody thought the topic was interesting. Of course they did. Maybe some of them had even seen the video on their own. It is interesting. Everybody had some opinion about it, And nobody was willing to talk. Not because of the usual fear of some, I'm afraid of putting on my hand, because it was specifically because they had it drilled into them that if they say the wrong thing about these issues, there could be hell to pay. There could be social sanction or worse. And that was probably the most outstanding, stood out the most shocking moment of my time as a teaching assistant. That was just incredible. It's interesting. It's important. They want to talk about it. And nobody will, and all of them see the reason similarly because they're afraid of the social sanction. So how did it get to that point? Well, that's a different story. I don't put the blame on the students. You have to put the blame on the people who have taught them to be scared, who have taught them that they must shut up rather than speak up. So that's not good. That should change. Yeah. But that's what happened.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. I think that's everything.